Psychology has its origins, of course, in philosophy. And philosophy for millennia was basically constructed around finding the mind. And they attempted to find the mind and the metaphysical issues related to mind without much success.
Psychology is the study of the human psyche. So the real question is, what's the psyche? And the truth is, we don't have a clue as to what it is. Those who try to reduce it to behaviors, to our cognitive processes, or to our physiology are tracking something important, but are not dealing with the basic mystery that the human psyche represents.
There are no meanings that are given to you by the world. Meaning-making as such is the central human activity. We construct our worlds. We each have different ones. We learn somehow to get along. And it's the process of constructing reality, constructing meaning-making. It's the construction of meaning that is so critical, where culture comes into the thing to such a degree.
As primitive man banded together into civilizations, they sought to provide answers to things that they did not understand. They invented fables, mythologies, and religions that embodied their existence and gave them a sense of meaning about themselves and their place in the world.
And underlying all these myths, some of them appearing very strange, they're explaining that cooking symbolizes human culture and eating raw food symbolizes animality. And so when the myth has to do with the origin of cooking, and cooking in different ways by baking or boiling or roasting, they're really talking about very deep philosophical problems, that people use these symbolic means to settle or try to settle or work on a dialectic that is essential to humanity.
Superstition held a prominent role among primitive thinkers, and those who fell ill or suffered misfortune looked for supernatural causes, anger from the gods or evil spirits.
They imbue certain objects with powers that they don't have, but if they believe in that power, it is powerful for them, just like voodoo. It's powerful because the people believe in it. Just like some people may believe that this pill will help them, and you know the placebo response, it actually does help them.
But even when you're hungry because the locusts eat your grain, or an epidemic comes and there's no obvious human agent there, or somebody sickens and dies, people make moral attributions about it, and they really want to know what the moral sense of it is. Now they can decide that the person who died or who's suffering is at fault, and that they are in effect being punished for something, or they can feel sometimes that they're being attacked illegitimately, that a witch or a sorcerer has attacked them.
Primitive man served under his king or ruler in exchange for basic necessities of food and physical protection, while his emotional and mental security were provided by a shaman or a sorcerer, a practitioner of metaphysics.
They're indigenous tribes that tend to be animistic, strong connection to nature. God is involved, or spirit world is involved in every aspect of their lives, and they feel that they're guided, they're protected. So if you have that, the shaman is only speaking through that greater force.
About 6 centuries before Christ, an amazing wave of consciousness swept the planet. In China, Confucius saw human growth as a lifelong process, with personality development occurring in early childhood. Ideas propounded by Freud and Piaget some 2,500 years later. Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, saw life as a balance between passive yin and the aggressive yang, inspiration for Carl Jung's ideas on inner and outer conflicts. Chuang Tzu's meditation of emptiness and reflection foreshadowed psychology's initial method of studying perception, thinking, and the mind. In India, the Buddha meditated until he was enlightened with the 4 noble truths that lead one to nirvana, a place of transcendental happiness where you are one with yourself.
The senses, they say, are subtle. More subtle than senses is mind. Yet finer than mind is intellect. That which is beyond the intellect is he.
The Dalai Lama said, we each have our own religions, but religions divide us. They don't unify us. It is our emotions that unify us. And by paying attention to what all people have in common, which is not the particular God that they believe in. And as he said, I'm a Buddhist, I don't believe there is a creator. That doesn't matter, he said, that's my business. But we all want to have some kind of happiness. We all want a sense of well-being and purpose and equanimity in life. And every human being wants that. And that's where we can build community.
In Greece, philosophers were developing an epistemology to answer fundamental questions about the nature of life, the existence of a supreme being, and man's essential qualities of mind, self, and soul.
Isn't that what psychology really wants, in some sense, to know? Where is the cause of the human action? Is it in the metaphysical world or the physical world? If you attribute human behavior and actions to mind and trace the word mind back through the eons, trace it back to the Greeks, soul is the original word to be used here. The soul is the conduit between humans and the gods on Mount Olympus.
Socrates and Plato saw psychological forces as a cause of mental disturbances and believed that madness results when a person's irrational animal-like psyche overwhelms the intellectual rational psyche.
The human psyche has ways of structuring experience in service to bringing pattern, bringing order, bringing meaning to the chaos which life really is. I mean, there's something archetypal every morning that greets us. It's the invitation to overthrow the powers of darkness. The part of us that would very much like to give up the struggle for consciousness, the struggle for developmental being, and opposed to that, of course, is, the life force itself.
Unlike Socrates, Plato wrote down his ideas about psychology, such as whether the heredity or the environment was a greater influence on human intelligence and personality.
That's the big issue that's always taken place in psychology, nature versus nurture, genetics and innateness versus environment, and it goes way back to the Greeks and John Locke and people like that who believed we were simply tabula rasa when we were born, a blank slate, and that the culture and the environment determined every single aspect of us. We learned everything, and we learned it through association.
Hippocrates, the first physician, believed the mentally ill were genuinely suffering and should be treated like other sick persons rather than moral degenerates. Hippocrates saw all sickness as being caused by an imbalance of bodily fluids or humours, a diagnosis that today might be described as a hormonal imbalance or a low level of neurotransmitters in the brain.
At one time, a variety of disorders, before even the microscope was invented. These microorganisms, bacteria, no one could see them, but yet once they were identified, then a lot of people realized that a lot of our infections were caused by these organisms, and they could identify them. And so pharmacotherapy is probably the most widely used treatment for a variety of different disorders. And in fact, when you look at the outcomes, it's still probably the most effective means to treat a lot of different psychological disorders.
Plato's student, Aristotle, formulated seminal psychological ideas about sleep, dreams, sensation, learning, and memory, and used a method that would later be called empiricism.
Yes, you can look back to Aristotle and say, yes, those are things that are psychological, but they're not they were not thought of in the same way that we think of psychology. That psychology, and the British scholar Graham Richards, I think, makes a almost amusing point, and he says it's more capital P psychology. That is, that we think of psychology now as a science or a discipline, and we think of it in ways that are distinctive from the way Aristotle thought about memory, or Da Vinci thought about perspective.
After the enlightened Greeks opened men's minds, the oppressed people under the rule of the Roman Empire were willing to take a leap of faith. The teachings of Jesus provided mental and emotional solace through thoughts rather than action or obedience to authority. Jesus also brought a new closure to the duality of spirit and matter by including the concept of God in the Holy Trinity and the belief that a better life existed after death.
I do know that at least in Argentine culture and in South American culture and in my clients, that they believe that they have a strong connection to God. They believe in the La Virgen de Guadalupe. They believe that they can contact specific connections and they will be helped. One of the common things that a Hispanic will say is, si Dios quiere, if God wills it. And that's just like a common saying like, hey, I'll see you tomorrow, if God wills it. It's a much more personal view of God's involvement in a person's life.
Through observation and reflection, Roman monk St. Augustine perceived the mind as the seat of the intellect, willpower, and self-conscious memory. Augustine made distinction between sense perception and the interpretation of the event by the mind, an advanced system of duality whereby consciousness divides the perceived and the perceiver into subject and object of thought. St. Augustine's writings provide a justification for psychology as a science, using procedural methods of introspection to study data generated from consciousness.
We have to become aware in depth psychology of the presence of some other part of our psyche other than consciousness from the ego standpoint. What is it that's watching us? What is it that's correcting us? What it is that's invested in us? Which is one of the reasons we pay attention to dreams, for example, because where do dreams come from? We don't know. You don't invent them consciously. You can't will up a certain kind of dream, and yet on an average of several times a night, this activity goes on, and we have reason to believe that nature doesn't waste energy. So it's quite likely that these dreams are our life as seen from a transcendent perspective.
In Persia, in the 10th century AD, the physician Avicenna further explicated the duality between spirit and matter by describing 5 inner senses of the mind that correlated with those of the body. These were imagination, common sense, sense judgment, memory, and fancy, an instinctual sense of good or bad. Avicenna extolled the virtues of self-discipline and sensory self-denial as a method of illuminating these higher senses of the mind while simultaneously achieving mystical awareness.
It's my conscious life in the presence of that which is transcendent. Whether you see it in the presence of divinity or the presence of some transpersonal energy coursing through each person, it sort of is beside the point. The question is, what does this encounter with the holy other, with the transcendent, call me to become aware of in my life?
Italian theologian Thomas Aquinas was one of the first Christian mystics to be recognized for ideas received through divine revelation. He distinguished between general revelations that came through observations of natural order and special revelations bestowed by God in the conscious mind. Thomas called the recognition of a revelation the first thought, and the application of a revelation through will the second thought. It was through the second thought that man has the freedom to choose and the responsibility to act, either for good or for evil, the choice being indicative of the mental and moral state of the individual.
Yes, we do have choices, as long as those choices are really coming out of consciousness. So the real question then is, when I make a choice, where's that choice coming from within me? Is it driven by a complex? Is it driven by my need to be accepted by others? What's it in service to, really? And then the ultimate question is, when I make a choice, not only what is it in service to, but can I ever ferret out the reasons or the many interplays of influences that are at work from the unconscious?
When the Bible was printed and distributed by Gutenberg in Germany in 1455, it heralded the end of the Dark Ages and the beginning of an intellectual and cultural renaissance. No longer was knowledge the sole province of the cloistered kings and priests. It became available to anyone with the ability to read and write. Knowledge grew exponentially due to the ease of dissemination in printed form. But not all books were designed for the advancement of science, such as the Malus Maleficarum, Handbook of the Witch Prickers Guild.
They start around the 1400s, so the Inquisition is well into its 2nd or 3rd century. What's evolved here is, can you help the state determine whether the person is demonically possessed or not with your witch pricking? The idea being that demons have entered your body through a pore in your skin. If you prick that point, the assumption was the person is insensate at that point. And of course what the witch prickers end up doing was punching the same point. And we know now with modern pain perception, the individual will habituate and eventually become insensate at that level. The person's a witch.
Dutch medical doctor Johann Weyer spoke out against the Malus Maleficarum, diagnosed witches as being mentally ill, and said he could cure them with a therapeutic relationship, a practice that credits Weyer as being the first psychiatrist. Nevertheless, more than 100,000 people were executed for witchcraft, one of the many occult practices psychology has helped to dispel through its scientific methods.
Psychology always has to deal with what are called its occult doubles. What's psychology really supposed to do, at least the scientific end of it? You're supposed to be able to predict what's going to happen in the future. And that's what mystics are supposed to do, and that's what, seances are about, and that's what the paranormal is about. So psychology in the 20th century took great trouble to try to separate themselves from the occult end of how we think about predicting.
German scholastic philosopher Rudolf Goclenius is credited with the invention of the term psychology, derived from the Greek psyche meaning soul and ology meaning study, science, together meaning the science of studying the soul. Goclenius didn't fancy himself a psychologist, but he did have a knack for words. He also came up with ontology, the study of being or existence, a notion that had been around since Socrates and Plato. Ontology has one basic question: what actually exists? From here, one must define exist or existence. Then, if something exists, there must be someone to perceive it. And in the process of perceiving it, how is that which exists changed by the perceiver, either by the sensory channels through which it is perceived, or by the mind that interprets the perception, and so on. Much of psychology has to do with the ways human beings perceive and interpret the world around them, and how they react to these perceptions.
The family and love of a family. It's a relationship. See, you never get married and say, I do, D-O-apostrophe-T. No. That's like I don't want you. They don't love you, L-O-V-E.
That we have certain ways that we see the world, categories of mind. There is a reality, but they can only fit in certain ways that we see the world. So we have to transform whatever is out there into those categories of mind. That construction changes whatever is out there. We don't really know what's out there. We have a sense that that could look like a couch, and it looks like that and has that color. But that's just an educated guess that we all kind of agree on. When people come into therapy, they have constructed a view of their world. They have constructed a view of themselves. And part of therapy works with that, the view of the world and the view that he or she has about himself or herself.
Dubbed the father of modern mathematics for his development of analytical geometry, René Descartes saw mind and body as separate entities and regarded information obtained from the physical senses as being unreliable, summarized in his famous motto, cogito ergo sum, I am thinking, therefore I exist.
The intellect is your cognitive processing. It is your perception of the world. Your spiritual self is the essence that can guide your intellect. The whole essence of growth and development and personality development is to be one, so that there is no separateness anymore.
Born in Amsterdam to a family of Portuguese Jews who had fled the Inquisition, Baruch Spinoza rejected Descartes' dualistic belief, saying that the body and the mind were simply different aspects of the same substance running parallel, and that God and nature were two names for the same reality. Spinoza held that human behavior was completely determined, and free will only exists in our capacity to know we are determined, and to understand why we act the way we do.
The problem with the concept of free will is it cannot be scientifically studied because scientists must live in a deterministic universe. So when you tell me that you have free will as a scientist, I'm going to ask you what you mean by that, and I'm going to trace your concept of free will back to some mechanism that will explain why you feel that you have free will, when in fact you must live, if you're a scientist, in a deterministic universe.
Englishman John Locke argued that human beings were born void of any innate ideas or knowledge, and that the mind is initially a blank slate, or a tabula rasa on which sensory experiences leave their tracks. Locke formalized the scientific philosophy of empiricism, a method of knowledge derived solely from actual experiences or deliberate experiments without preconceived notions, intuition, or reasoning.
We have a kind of meta-awareness. We're aware of our own awareness, although that's sometimes exaggerated. I think humans don't know very much about their own minds or their own social structures. That's why psychologists and anthropologists are in business, if you like, because people can't really explain how they think about most things. They don't understand, for example, how they understand the sounds of a language and understand what they mean, and they don't know how they put a sentence together. They can't explain the grammar of their own language. They can explain some aspects of their social institutions and practices, but mostly they don't really understand them analytically the way a social scientist does.
Scottish philosopher David Hume saw the self as being derived from mental impressions, accumulating and associating with other mental impressions. Repetition of these associations became habits that influenced cognition and behavior, and determined survival. In this sense, Hume was to precipitate Spencer and Darwinian evolution, and later cognitive psychology. Locke's and Hume's ideas excluded the existence of God, and caused Irish Bishop George Berkeley to issue his own treatise on empiricism in the effort to prevent widespread atheism. Berkeley asserted that things exist as a result of being perceived, and in the event no human is around, God does the perceiving for him, and that any order humans may perceive is simply the language of God speaking to them.
In just about every religion that I know of, and there's always a few who go off in this, what we call this more spiritual or mystical direction, because that's a possibility in all humans' lives. And they feel they're in touch with something much deeper, and they may be.
German philosopher Immanuel Kant, in his famous book Critique of Pure Reason, made a distinction between a posteriori knowledge sourced from phenomena, appearances in time and space that can be apprehended by the senses, and a priori knowledge, which exists independent of experience and sensory impressions, and can never reach noumena, the thing itself. Thus, our realities are not constructed out of real things, but only their appearances.
So if we're talking about the history, it does reflect a transition for where we put the power of being human and the responsibility. If we believe that God was going to take care of us, that's very different from what psychology says. That says, you have to take care of you.
Franz Anton Mesmer claimed he could cure a variety of ailments by channeling powers of animal magnetism, a practice that unified the medical establishment against him. Nevertheless, his series of mesmerism had a popular following, and Mesmer is often credited with influencing the development of hypnotism as psychotherapy. French physician Philippe Pinel became concerned with the plight of the mentally ill after a friend had degenerated into mania and finally committed suicide. He took charge of a hospital housing criminals, syphilitics, and mental patients, and discontinued inhumane physical treatments such as trephination. where they would bore holes into the lunatics' heads to release the demons.
All of these sort of primitive treatments had one thing in common, and that was that they came out of some kind of theory about mental illness. One of the beliefs about mental illness was that people suffered mental breakdowns because of sensory overload. In fact, one of the reasons for getting them out into the country, into these asylums and into a more relaxed and controlled and stable life, was that you eliminated a lot of the rush of life that may have caused problems.
Peniel wanted to leave a legacy for others to study through written interviews and detailed medical histories. Peniel is considered by many to be the father of modern psychiatry. In America, physician, writer, and humanitarian Benjamin Rush experimented with a wide variety of innovative treatments on the mentally ill.
Benjamin Rush was a psychiatrist and one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. He was very interested in asylum care at the end of the 18th century. Among other things, developed a chair which became known as the tranquilizer chair, sometimes the Benjamin Rush tranquilizer chair. If sensory overload is the issue, then Rush reasoned if you put them in this chair for a few hours and thus reduce their sensory information, unable to move or see or do anything, so you might behave a little better after you got out of that just because you didn't want to get in that chair again.
Rush was also one of the first to recognize drug and alcohol addiction as a mental disease from which abstinence is the only cure.
Some people who are alcoholic have had alcohol until they have no liver left. And you can tell them, if you keep drinking, you're going to lose your family, you're going to lose your children, you're going to lose your house, you're going to be homeless, and you're going to die. And an honest alcoholic, most of them will say, I'd rather be dead.
Austrian neuroanatomist Franz Joseph Gall developed a theory he called cranioscopy, by which he claimed he could assess personality and mental developments by the external shape of the skull, a notion that offended scientists and religious leaders alike. Cranioscopy was renamed phrenology, and though rejected as a science in France, was welcomed in England, where the ruling class used it to justify the inferiority of its colonial subjects. Gall's phrenology anticipates modern brain scan techniques.
So thoughts, feelings, memories are the end result of how your entire brain is working and functioning with different areas are. But with modern day brain imaging techniques, you can identify particular brain regions, brain structures, neural networks, different areas that seem to be highly synchronized and working together to create memories, be involved in certain thoughts, certain actions, and so on and so forth.
Following in the footsteps of Spinoza, Kant, and others in the quest to design an irrefutable model to explain mental processes, German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel developed a three-step system of logic he said would lead to absolute knowledge. Hegel's dialectics begins with an original idea, thesis, that would cause the creation of an opposing idea, antithesis, eventually resulting in a compromise, synthesis, that would become the new original idea, thesis, and so on. To Hegel, sensations alone were simply immature thoughts, and valid consciousness was a logical synthesis of idea and will. Johann Herbart saw cognitive units joining and forming mental complexes, which in turn collected into systems that developed mass and influenced behavior, paving the way for Gestalt and cognitive psychology. Two German physicians, Weber and Fechter, sought to discover the exact mathematical relationship between body and mind via the use of stimuli. Though primitive, inexact, and later refuted, the Weber-Fechner law embodied the attempt to scientifically quantify the mind-body relationship, a precursor to the field of experimental psychology. English philosopher and political theorist Herbert Spencer extricated psychology from sociology on one hand and biology on the other, establishing psychology's place as a bridge between sciences of life and society. In 1855, Spencer wrote The Principles of Psychology, in which he explored the mind as a biological counterpart to the body, and that the human intelligence evolves slowly in response to the physical environment. Today, Spencer is chiefly remembered as the father of social Darwinism, and for his eminent phrase that encapsulates evolutionist theory, survival of the fittest.